Welcome to Censored, the podcast that's much more interested in what you read in bed than what you wear. I'm Aoife Vertnach, and thank you for listening to this summer bonus special. I'm still talking about censure, but this time on the telly. I'm joined by Dr. Morgan Waite, who knows a hell of a lot more than I do about the history of Irish television. Hi Morgan, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Aoife.
I'm very thrilled to talk about what is perhaps one of the more famous incidents on Irish television. In fact, you could say the most famous scandal. Like, the internet is covered with articles on it and opinion pieces, and it's got its own catchphrase, the Bishop and the Nightie, which is hilarious and absurd. And so maybe you could explain to us, as if none of us ever saw it, because the visual is actually lost, there's only the audio. So explain to us what happened. What is the Bishop and the Nightie incident?
Okay, so the Bishop and the Nightie happened in 1966 on what was basically the equivalent of the Valentine's Day special of the Late Late Show. So basically, Gay Byrne was playing a game with this couple, the Foxes. And he asked Eileen, the wife, what she was wearing on the night of her, the night of that she got married. And she basically said, he asked her what color the nightie was. And she said, I wasn't wearing anything. I wasn't wearing a nightie, basically.
Sounds reasonable. I mean, normal.
Fairly reasonable, and what you would expect from a married couple. But yeah, so then basically the Bishop of Clonfert, I believe he rang into the show, like he rang into RT immediately to say, this needs to go off the air, this is a terrible thing that is happening, and he was very upset about it. They didn't cut off the air or anything, but subsequent to it, there were a few news articles around it, and eventually the station was annoyed enough that they made Byrne give a kind of half-hearted apology, saying, I don't want to offend anybody's tastes, and that was the end of it. It became a really big thing in sort of like Irish media. I actually think much later, sort of around the 50th anniversary of it in around 2016. And I know this because at the time I was doing my master's on the church and television, and in the period, and everyone kept asking me about the Bishop of the Nightie, mainly because John Bowman had done an episode of it on his history program. So yeah, it did spur, as far as I know, a couple of letters to the editor in some major newspapers. There were sort of splashes about it around, and yeah, it has been painted in media as this huge controversy that really upset people in Ireland. And it's almost always pointed out as something that like upset the public. But in reality, it was really just that this bishop was mad. There was press coverage about it. One of the first things that I did when I started the PhD was I was like, I'm going to look at like flashpoints in sort of like, Irish television history and see if there's anything there about like women or anything like that. So I went to the Bishop and the Nightie first, but if you actually go into like the newspapers and stuff like that, there's very little there in terms of people actually being upset. There's nothing at all in the RT guide, which is normally where, like, if someone wrote a letter, that's where it would have ended up. Now, I do think the station got a few phone calls and stuff like that. It's something that people have, like, found and has become this huge sensation in sort of modern Irish media, but that I don't actually think had a huge amount of impact at the time. So that's my potted explanation of the Bishop and the Nightie and how I feel about it.
Like, do you think that even the title of it, The Bishop and the Nightie, it's very evocative of a certain collision of church and sex, and it's, to be honest, Irish people do like to harp on about being Catholic in a bad way and, the Catholic legacy and being under the cosh of the bishops. And do you think that the way that it can be summarised like that makes it kind of sexy for us to think about as a controversy?
Absolutely. It has like everything. It has the church. It has, like women's sexuality. It has Gay Byrne. So it has all of these things that, you can point to it and say, wasn't Ireland backwards in, the 60s, and weren't people really upset about this? And it also, I think, in terms of like people's sort of perceptions of television in Ireland, it fits really well because when you look at stuff, when you look at sort of like the way that people conceptualize television in the 60s, it very much is like the Late Late and Gay Byrne like brought sex to Ireland to the point that like that is something that like loads of people have said in a number of different contexts. The first of which I believe was Oliver Flanagan, like on an actual episode of The Late Late Show.
That's very meta.
Yeah. So it speaks to all of those things. And I think for that reason, it's something that really has been like latched onto as this like major incident. And so it makes sense that people have, you know, latched onto it in this way, but it's not necessarily, you know, the biggest controversy that like RTE ever had.
So what other controversies do you think kind of merit our attention that maybe we're sidelining because they don't have great catchy titles, and I suppose they don't feature Gay Byrne, who is, you know, the most important broadcaster of the 20th century, arguably, and hugely popular. So the other controversies, when they don't have him, maybe that's part of the reason.
Yeah, well, anything without Gay Byrne is going to get, you know, significantly less attention. So there is that. There's a number of different controversies. Like, I would say that the biggest controversy during like the 60s was actually the sit down and be counted controversy.
Oh, we see. I haven't heard of that at all. What is sit down and be counted?
Yeah, no one ever has. So it's some people, but like, you know, people who are really into, you know, studying Irish television, but like, but it's basically, Sit Down and Be Counted was it's actually a book that I have actually sitting next to me here that 3 producers at the station wrote. So it was Leela Doolin, Bob Quinn, and Jack Dowling. And basically, they had all sort of together resigned from RTE because they felt that the station was putting advertising imperatives over the you know, sort of public broadcasting ethos that they were supposed to be following. So they all resigned. There was an episode of The Late Late where they all went on and talked about why they resigned. And at the time, this was huge. Like, people referenced it in the Doll. People, like, there were loads of different, like, you can get loads of different letters to the editor where people are referencing, you know, the Leela Doolin, Bob Quinn, Jack Dowling affair. This is kind of a major controversy about, like, concepts of what broadcasting, you know, means. It wasn't necessarily, like, it's definitely not sexy because, again, like, you'd have to read the book and all of that to, you know, really get into it. And people don't want to, you know, do that necessarily. But yeah, and then there's a good few others that are kind of around similar topics, like a lot of times about like advertising, and like, you know, different conceptions of what public broadcasting should mean. And I can get into them if you would like me to. Oh
yes, please do. I mean, that's really interesting that we can boil something down to a bishop having a hissy fit and think it's very interesting and then ignore the bigger ideological discussions of what public broadcasting is supposed to do.
Yeah, and like it's important as well because like people weren't that invested in the Bishop of the Nightie. Like they weren't like, you know, that interested in that. But even at the time, people were actually interested in like, what is my license fee going to pay? Like, what is like, you know, what does like public broadcasting mean? And like, so this incident started with like at the very start of it, not terribly far away from when the Bishop of the Nightie happened around 66, 67 with a show called Home Truths. And it was basically a women's program, more or less. It was a magazine program. There was a cooking segment. They gave all sorts of different, you know, household tips. And they had a consumer segment. Because the Jack Dowling, who was one of the producers who eventually left, was, you know, what he viewed the show as was a vehicle by which to inform working class housewives about sort of their rights, better ways to like save money, and to really sort of speak to that audience specifically. It was a bit of a divergence from what the station had been doing earlier, because the show before that was called Home for Tea. It was like absurdly middle class, to the point where one commentator once said it resembled the glossy magazines when they treat their, you know, when they're about to treat their readers like imbeciles or something along those lines. But anyway, so at Home Truths, they were writing scripts about, like, you know, ways for housewives to get the best deal on nail polish remover. Like, they showed that, like, you could go to the chemist and get acetone to remove, I should say nail varnish, actually, sorry, American. But how they could, you know, do that and not have to actually, you know, buy the branded nail varnish remover. And that very specific incident led to the advertising manager at RTE at the time to come in and say, "You can't run this segment anymore. It's losing us money. We're not going to do this anymore." And just like, he didn't necessarily axe it outright, but what he said was, "You have to show me all of your scripts ahead of time in order for me to clear them, so that I know that we're not losing money out of this." It was very much like, it wasn't entirely explicit censorship, but it was certainly, you know, a nod to say, please stop doing this. And that was initially what led Jack Dowling to, he first left the show, and he left the station very soon after that. And then that sort of snowballed then into the, you know, sit down and be counted incident. So that's another one there, just around, like, you know, nail varnish. And there's another one on toothpaste, and I don't know, they were very mad because they had to at one point showed a segment on the dangers of smoking, and then a doctor and then an ad for cigarettes like right afterwards. So like it was a mess for them, to be fair, but it was definitely them putting, you know, advertising imperatives well above any sort of ideas of public broadcasting.
Yeah, that's much more serious than a bishop getting cross. I mean, that is about not being able to make a program because of commercial sensitivities, which seems like a much bigger issue.
Yeah, it's significantly big. It's a significantly bigger issue, and it's an issue that created a lot more like controversy in terms of like letters to the editor, and in terms of like saying there was quite a large controversy actually around. They did a profile on sort of housing and house prices in a certain part of Cork that at the time was represented, I believe, by Lemass, I want to say.
Was it Jack Lynch?
It was Jack Lynch.
Yeah. Sorry.
I always go with, like, sorry.
The two L's, they're both Taoiseach. It's understandable.
So yeah, so there are dull debates where they're referencing what happened at Home Truths and how can RT say that they were, you know, like actually representing what Irish people like wanted to see, or their interests, basically. So in that way, it is a much bigger incident than anything to do with the Bishop and the Nightie. Like that sort of all fizzled out within, you know, about a month, as far as I know. And there really wasn't a huge amount of like, there was no public pressure to take like the Late Late off the air or anything like that. It was just,
yeah. And a few outraged letters. And to be honest, you know, there are cranks everywhere. You can muster up a few letters on nearly anything.
Yeah. More or less, you definitely can. And there really weren't, like, it's a very small amount that you'd see in, like, the actual press about it. And, like, I've seen much bigger, like, back and forth, like, letter writing, you know, sort of incidents. Like, I mean, one of the biggest letter writing incidents was also around Home Truths, but nothing to do with anything to do with censorship. It was just that Monica Sheridan, who was a celebrity chef in Ireland in the 60s, she had been on Home for Tea, had done their cooking segment for many years. And she was asked to come on to Home Truths, but she was told that she could only have, her budget was basically, her budget was like £4 for a week of food shopping, basically. And she said, that's too low. I can't cook for that. I won't do it. And this was a public incident, and people were basically writing back and forth, arguing with each other over whether or not, like, and there were, I don't know, a couple dozen letters on this to the very specific back and forth is all in Evening Herald, but in a couple of different newspapers you can see it as well. And that's a lot more than, you know, ever came in about the Bishop of the Nightie. So
it's interesting you talk about the way that people are writing letters debating RTE's role. Did people write into RTE often, sort of asking them to do things or responding to a programme like Home Truths? I mean, apart from the Late Late Show and the Bishop, is there a pattern of people writing in and saying, I didn't like this, please change it? So
the issue with answering that question is that RTE has not kept a huge amount of anything that anybody, they don't have a huge amount of documentation on, like, you know, things that people wrote to them. A lot of stuff has been lost, like a huge amount. Like you wouldn't even see, Like, there wouldn't even be many letters like that people wrote about or to the late, within RT. It's quite rare to find something like that. What is common is they would take the letters, and the ones that they liked, they would put into the RT guide. There's loads of those. So you can see that people were doing this and interacting with the station in that way. And just like as a historian, the big thing that you get is, did somebody write to a newspaper about this? Because that's how you're really going to actually get at it. Now, there are situations in which the letters were retained, but like they're few and far between. But there's a program that was called Southside, and there's a bunch of letters that they saved from that show because it was also a major controversy in RT. But there aren't a lot of letters that you can find, but I think it was a common enough practice.
What was Southside? It's another program I've never heard of.
So no one has ever heard of Southside. I actually did a survey for the PhD to see, like, one of the questions was like, what do you remember? And like had a list of programs, and only one person remembered Southside. And this person was importantly from Cork. And I think that is because Southside was a soap opera. It was set in the suburbs of Cork. Interestingly enough, it was initially actually like the spec script is set in Dublin, but they really needed like something going on in Cork to satisfy Cork people. So they ended up setting it there. So it's a really interesting program. It was written by a guy named David Hayes, who I just believe was a sound guy. It's quite a progressive program. Like, it does a lot where it talks about sort of, it deals with sexuality a lot more explicitly than the Late Late Show often would have. There's some sort of incident in which a woman got pregnant on the show and actually considered having an abortion, but there's no record. There's exactly. This was 1969, I should say.
Unthinkable.
But unfortunately for me and everyone else, the script that plot would follow based on the sort of sparse evidence that I have in like the papers and the letters, those two scripts do not exist in the RT archives. So it's very difficult to get any further with that, which is annoying for a number of reasons. And I don't know if they were gone intentionally or if there was just an accident. The rest of the scripts are there, and that's all I know and can say. But yeah, so it was quite a progressive show, and it did a lot of really interesting things. And for that reason, obviously, it made a lot of people really mad. So a bunch of people wrote into RTE to say, you have to take this off the air, like, immediately, for a number of reasons. So obviously the sort of unplanned pregnancy incident upsets people, but that's actually not what's most prominent in the letters. People are more upset about there was an adultery plot where the two people don't even actually end up committing adultery. They just kind of play around with the idea that they're going to. But this really, really upset people, and they didn't like it. And actually, specifically Cork people did not like it because of the letters. Over half of them are from Cork specifically, and people saying, we're absolutely not like this. Please stop saying this.
As I sit in Cork, I can confirm that Cork people will complain about misrepresentation or any representation loudly.
Yeah, it's just, because it's interesting, to be fair. If you look at, the Reardons, or you look at, Tulkerrow. So the Reardons was another soap opera that was set in, it's kind of it's not really anywhere, but it's the Midlands in, technically I think it was supposed to be Kilkenny, but there's no real, explanation of where it is, but it's in rural Ireland, and Tulkerrow is a soap opera that was set in Dublin. And if you look at the reaction to both of those shows, it does come from, Tulkerrow, Dublin people are mad, the Reardons, people everywhere else are mad. So it is that people relating to things that are, to do with them, it's going to make them more, annoyed at it. It's not specific to Cork. It's just, with the specific show about Cork.
So when people recognize themselves, or perhaps suspect that they recognize themselves and their communities, they get cross and write in asking for it to be changed.
Yeah, and I think it's both when they recognize themselves or when they don't recognize themselves, when they're just, because you can look at it in two different ways, I guess. You can look at it as, you can give the people some credit and say they're looking at this, it's set where they're from, and they're seeing something that is not representative of the lives that they live. They don't live in a world where, men cheat on their wives or girls get pregnant and obviously they do, but maybe they don't see that they do, if that makes sense. Or you can look at it as they recognize themselves and they don't want this out there. They don't want any of this discussed because they do know that these things happen, but they don't want them to be, pushed out there and, sully the view of where they're from to other people. So I think it could be either way, depending on how much credit you want to give, sort of outraged people.
The concept of outrage is so interesting because it's such an important part of censorship. And also, I mean, this isn't censorship, people writing in. This would be much more in the line of censure, as in it's kind of a feedback from the audience and it's up to the program makers whether they want to take that on or not. So it's not quite the same as censorship, but it could have an effect on the programs that are made. Do you think it did?
I think it depends on the program. So like with Southside, I think there was a lot of pressure on RTE to get rid of the program. And importantly, when the program ends, it is number 1 in the TAM ratings, which are just like the rating system in Ireland. Like it's inconsistently. So people are watching the show, but they do get rid of it. I can't say for sure that they got rid of it because people were outraged by it or because it was so scandalous. I definitely think it was somewhat to do with that. Now, the other sort of end is again this sort of budget imperative that like RT had to deal with, because when Southside was going to go into a 3rd season, it was the year that RT had to host the Eurovision because Dana had won, and it bankrupted them like almost completely. So they get rid of a huge amount of stuff, and Southside is one of those things that goes. But maybe it was a bit convenient that Southside is the thing that goes in the budget crisis, considering that it is like probably the most popular show on air at the time. It can have an effect, but there's a lot of times other things at play, and there's always, some other, with RTE at least, there's always some other excuse that can be given to say we didn't bow to public pressure.
It can be hard with institutions as well to disentangle all of the factors that go into making a decision, and particularly because they don't write half of them down, so you're only working on the ones they've written down.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. No one wrote down, like, we hate Southside. People are mad. Let's get rid of this. Like, so it's just a matter of like trying to figure out exactly what they were thinking at any given time, and I don't know. Allowing, credit for all options, you can, again, give them, the benefit of the doubt, or you can not give them the benefit of the doubt. So,
yeah, I mean, that's very much a position that you adopt, isn't it? It's like, do you want to see the suppression side, or do you want to see the possibly no money side? Choose your argument.
Yeah, and it comes up a lot, and a lot of RT actually is the no money side, but a lot of times it is a specific sort of like, sometimes it's no money with suppression at the same time. So like in the case of like Home Truths and, not wanting that sort of, because it was also a more progressive program, and they may not have wanted that, messaging out there, and the advertising imperatives just sort of sealed it.
Yes, yeah. It's fascinating to try and disentangle how censure works, because it's so much more complicated than censorship, which tends to be straightforward prohibition and law, and that's it. But censure is very nebulous, isn't it?
Yeah, it's significantly more nebulous because you can very rarely point to like one specific thing, whereas with censorship, I mean, sometimes it's as much as, someone, crossing something out with a pen and, sort of see that is something that is, that has been said no to. But with censure, you kind of have to figure out how is this actually reacted to in the period, and how does that interact with, what was gotten rid of. So it's definitely not as straightforward.
I think that's why people get more upset with censure, because they can't see it happening as easily, because it's not clear who's got the power and where the power shifts to at different points. And I think that's what the panic over cancel culture is about, because no one's quite sure how things are working and, of course, whether it exists at all. And so they, I think that's part of what drives that fear and the panic over that, as opposed to censorship, which, funnily enough, people often just accept government censorship and just shrug.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that like, because people can't see the specific power structure that's actually at work there, it is a lot more like, it becomes confusing to people. And like, particularly something along the lines of like, cancel culture, a lot of times it's like, well, does this person have more power to cancel things than I do? And how am I supposed to sort of, get across like my power to say that I don't like a thing and this other person does, and how do you balance, those competing interests, and and can you even say that cancel culture actually exists?
Because in many ways you could argue versions of it have always existed, as in a certain amount of outrage can change things, but it's very unpredictable as to which outrage will change what, and no one can be ssure. So,
and the other thing is, like, how long does the outrage last, and how long does that actually, like, how long does that maintained until, like, particularly with, like, in the modern day, like, when can somebody sort of come back from that outrage? And, like, is there sort of an end to the censure at that point? And is there, like, an end to, like, the, cancellation, so to speak? And a lot of times now it does seem like there is very much, like, a clear time limit for when people just kind of, forget and go back to, like, liking whatever thing was canceled before. And they're just like, oh, okay, we can like that again. Cool.
I mean, in fairness, outrage is exhausting,
It is.
It's hard to sustain for long periods of time.
Yeah, and, like, there's so many things to be outraged about now. Like, you'd envy people in the past at a certain level. Like, they just had to be mad about, like, a little show in Cork, and, like, there were probably a few other things to be mad about. But now you could be mad about, 50 different things in a given day because you have too much access to things.
Yeah, there's just too much news. There's too much information. But do you think then that broadcasters like RTE, did they see it as their role to challenge people like that, to kind of provoke outrage, or were they trying not to and created it accidentally, if you know what I mean?
I think it depends on what you mean by RTE. So, like, RTE as an organization, so the people who run the show, the authority, the higher ups, the director general, all of those people, they did not want to cause outrage. They genuinely wanted pretty middle of the road things. And that's what they got most of the time. Most of the time, RTE was really this very status quo organization that did not rock the boat in any major way in the period. But when you talk about people who worked at RTE, so like someone like David Hayes or Jack Dowling or Leela Dolan or Bob Quinn, they wanted to rock the boat, and they felt that that was their role as people making programming. So you have a lot of competing interests there between, people who, they have to have people employed to make the shows, and they can't just get rid of all of them. So they have a certain agenda, they have a certain idea, but they were always competing and being pushed up against by the station itself, like saying, we don't actually, want to put any of this out there. Could you guys not just make something like, light and fluffy and fun for everybody?
I suppose in institutions there are a lot of competing interests, and RTE is a relatively large institution by Irish standards, so it must have camps and factions and power struggles within it that reflect different agendas, and sometimes they win and sometimes they lose.
Yeah, I mean, much like any other institution, there's always going to be, different philosophies within it. And I mean, even among program makers, there wasn't necessarily like one idea of how everything should be. You definitely had a faction in the 60s, and particularly the late 60s, who really did want to push the envelope. And they were completely pushed out. And the people who were left behind, some of them agreed with them to a certain extent, but some of them really didn't. And there's always going to be, sort of competing ideas of how to run a station and all of that. It's just coming to mind that there was another sort of like Eurovision incident where, RTE staff, including Owen Harris, kind of hilariously, went and protested outside of the Eurovision the year in 71 when Ireland was hosting. That was like, you could point to that as this like big controversy where RTE staff are rioting, and you can see there this very specific faction of the station who doesn't want the commercial interests to win out. But on the other side of that, I've met people who actually like worked on it, like particularly production assistants, and they were furious that, someone would come and say that their hard work was like, just, commercial, like boondoggle and terrible and all of that. So there's always that, back and forth that even within the organization, people aren't going to agree.
It's just fascinating. It's particularly interesting to me that we've managed to talk about the Bishop and the Nightie and completely debunk it. I mean, this is a debunking episode, isn't it?
I guess so. Like, I will like talk about this to anybody who like ever asks me about the Bishop and the Nightie. I'm just like, it didn't really happen. It's not really a thing. And like, of course it did happen. And I appreciate like why it has been brought out in the way that it is, because it is such a good story. And it's such like it's a good way to get clicks on an article. It's a good way to get people to listen to your show. And like, but as like a television historian, it always drives me nuts because I'm just like, but this wasn't, there's so many like, bigger incidents at RTE that are going on, no one ever, knows about or wants to talk about. So.
And there was a programme made by RTE, I don't know if you've ever seen it, the series Scannel, which is the Irish for scandal. And it featured a discussion of a programme called The Spike that was axed unexpectedly in the middle of the run because there was a nudie lady shown in one of the scenes. And so RTE has made a programme documenting this past scandal, which has all of the necessary ingredients to become popular history scandal. Nudity, offended clergy types, well, no, not clergy, the League of Decency, they're, moral outrage, lay people. And even though RTE has done this work and made the programme, it's like a dead letter in popular terms. Nobody talks about the Spike. It's silence.
Yeah, I mean, it is this like quite big, it is this like relatively big incident. Now, I can't speak a huge amount to the Spike just because like it's much later. Now, there was an article recently written about the Spike in Alphaville Journal, I believe, I want to say. And it does go through the incident, but it's an academic article. So it's not like, people aren't out there, reading it like, regularly. But yeah, it is interesting that RTE made this themselves about this scandal, and people aren't paying attention to it. But it's also interesting just that they made it themselves as if like they're very like, and they love The Bishop and the Nightie as well. Like it's up on the RTE archive. Like I'd say there's someone in the works back there trying to make a documentary about that. Like they love the idea that they, were here and pushed these envelopes on like sex and sexuality in Ireland. And I think that fits really well with their narrative. So it's interesting that they're really, they themselves are so instrumental in highlighting, the sort of like instances of like censorship and all of that, like in their own organization. I think that's interesting.
It is, isn't it? That they are part of the myth making about their past, and part of the popular discussion. They help set the terms as well, even though you could argue they're an incredibly biased actor in this, but they are a very important way of the story getting out there, especially through programs that they make themselves about their own past.
Yeah, like they're very involved in their own history and sort of the way that it is told and the way that it goes into sort of like the popular consciousness and all of that. And it is what we sort of talked about at the start, where you have like, Gay Byrne shows up and, introduces sex. And like, that is very much like how RTE likes to view itself, as like, we're the Late Channel. And like, like we did all of these, important, sexy things. And then we opened up Ireland in these ways. And, yeah, and I think that's probably part of the reason the Bishop and the Nightie is such like is so widely out there. Yeah, they really were much more of a, status quo organization most of the time. So it's not necessarily the correct narrative, if that makes sense.
I mean, it's part of it, but there are, of course, programs that are deeply conservative on the same channel. Yeah, it always interests me how we focus on Gay Byrne, because I came from a radio household. The radio was always on. So, of course, there was Gay Byrne. But Marion Finucane was also huge, and my mother loved Marion because she was a feminist and she was quite an activist person in her political views. And I mean, Marion was God really in our house, and we never hear about Marion Finucane's show as transforming Ireland, even though I remember it being quite a politically conscious and relatively radical radio show for its time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like you can see that kind of work, and you can see it as well with like a program like sort of like, like Women Today was a radio program in the very late 70s that was extremely like forward thinking and probably more radical than like anything that like Gay Byrne was doing on the radio. But I think that speaks to some of the ways that like, it really just speaks to the ways that like women are sidelined in that memory. Like the credit's always going to go to Gay Byrne and not Marion Finucane because, I don't know, he's the the father of Ireland, Uncle Gabo, like that's who we have to listen to. And Marion Finucane, very much does get sidelined in that, and many other women get sidelined in that as well. So.
Yeah, and the invention of sex, like the Late Late Show invented sex. I mean, there are advice columns in The Independent and the Press where they are perhaps not giving sex advice, but they are certainly skirting around those kinds of issues in the 60s before Gay Byrne talks about sex on the telly. So he isn't the only person doing that particular job at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. But only women are reading those. So why would anyone, care? And it is true. Like, there is definitely stuff going on before that. And I would also, like, really importantly, like, contend that the Late Late itself, outside of, say, like, the Bishop and the Nightie incident, and then stuff when you go sort of further into, like, the late 70s and the 80s, for most of the 60s, the Late Late was not a particularly, like, radical space. It was actually very light, fluffy, total light entertainment. And was not necessarily it wasn't actually necessarily the most progressive space on Irish television. That only really changes as you get into, like, sort of into the 70s, and you see some sort of level of, like, more pushing the envelope. And yeah, I think sometimes the 60s Late Late and the 80s Late Late get kind of conflated, because in the 60s it wasn't really that interesting. Like, it was very interesting. People loved watching it, but it wasn't necessarily what was introducing sex to Ireland week after week. A lot of times it was just like, like very boring panels about, like, someone wrote a book, or, now let's go to the musical guest. Like, it wasn't introducing sex to Ireland most of the time.
Did he have Edna O'Brien on at all in the 60s when she was, the bête noire of the censors and so famous for being so scandalous?
Not so far as I know. And importantly, he very rarely had any women on. I think that's there's letters in, like, like the RT guide being like, could you put a woman on the panel of the Late Late? Like, maybe. You
mean they noticed?
Yeah.
Oh my God, it must have been bad.
Women noticed. They were like, no one's there. Like, why is no one here for us? Like, and, like, one of them responded like, oh, well, we had a woman, like, 10 weeks ago and she participated. And it was like, okay, so you just don't have any women there. And that's your, like, what you do. And so there was not a lot of interest in hearing women's voices on the Late Late at all. So no, he didn't. As far as I know, he did not have Edna O'Brien.
It's just so fascinating. I think it's interesting. You could be right about that. We see the clips of the 1980s and the 1990s Late Late. I mean, there are a lot of them online, and they're discussing condoms and homosexuality. And I think conflating it with the 60s makes a lot of sense, that we're seeing like it's all the same programme. But also, I did watch the Late Late in the 80s and the 90s, and I can categorically say most of the time it was boring as shite. It was dull. My parents had it on. There was nothing else to watch. I mean, we had no choice. We weren't allowed to choose the television. And a lot of the time it was quite dull, really. There were very occasional moments like that of scandal, but they were also much later in the evening. And, teenagers would have been sent to bed before all of that happened. So if they were introducing sex to the audience, it was most definitely people who were already having it.
Yeah, so they weren't really, bringing the idea to anybody. Everyone probably already had the idea, who was watching. But yeah, like, that is the thing as well, is that, like, it is a weekly show, so it's not going to, create, any sort of waves every single week. And a lot of times people just draw out these very specific incidents about it and make that sort of the whole of the Late Late, when that's not really what it was. It wasn't always the envelope pusher that people suggest that it was. A lot of times it was just a status quo as anything else that was, coming up onto, RT.
There was a lot of entertainment. Like, Peter Ustinov was on regularly doing funny voices, which I'm not complaining about. It was very entertaining, but it's perhaps not what it's best remembered for.
No. And in the 60s, that was more of it than anything. Like, you really don't see until the early 70s, there's kind of a shakeup at the show, spread mostly by, I think, Leela Dolan, when she sort of, she has a role towards the end of the decade in sort of reshaping it. There wasn't really a huge amount of focus on, like, current affairs or anything until that point. It was all really like this, like, it wasn't the place where Ireland had its discussions necessarily. It was the place where, you turned on to see, whoever happened to be, the musical guest that week. So.
Yeah, we used to dread the musical specials. Oh my God, you have to turn those off straight away. It's like 2 hours of this same music over and over again. Even if you liked the artist, you were like, it's just too much,
Yeah, fair.
Morgan, thank you so much. That has been just a fascinating romp through the RTE archives, the best of them, the worst of them, random soap operas I've never heard. I mean, I feel completely enlightened after that.
Well, thank you as well. I always really enjoy telling people about random RT soap operas that nobody remembers anymore. So,
it's such a pity that the archive has been thinned out and they can't show these old ones, and we can sit there and admire the bad haircuts and the dodgy accents.
Yeah, it really is. Like, the loss of footage is a real tragedy. You can still see, like, if you are interested in seeing, what Southside actually looked like, there are stills from a photo shoot that they did for the RTV guide. So you can see sort of the, the weird haircuts and the, very sort of late 60s, 70s wardrobe. And the woman who played the daughter in the show, Trisha, wearing a miniskirt, and theoretically the first miniskirt on RT. So.
Oh, well, I mean, that's a landmark, much better than the Bishop and the Nightie, the first miniskirt.
Yep.
Great. Thanks so much. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.